Hold formation. They think we're already dead. Let's disappoint them. Lieutenant Commander Dane Vorex's voice cut through the command deck like a blade, sharp and unyielding. His hands gripped the edges of his console, knuckles blanched under the dim emergency lighting. Outside the reinforced viewport, the Zatoran apex bore down like a celestial executioner, its jagged silhouette backlit by the slow rotation of Earth's outermost defense grid. Aboard the Iron Bastion, the deck trembled beneath him, not from impact, not yet, but from the pressure differential caused by the apex's graviton compression field, distorting the space around them. The bulkheads groaned like a sinking ship, unseen forces warping the very structure of his vessel. Somewhere behind him, a power relay spat sparks, the acrid sting of burnt polyfiber crawling up his nose. "Firing solutions ready, sir!" Ensign Reddick's voice was taut, sweat gleaming against his brow as his fingers hovered over the rail cannon triggers. The display in front of him pulsed red, tracking the apex's supercharged axial emitters. Those would be the first to fire. "Negative," Vorex said, steel in his tone. "Hold. Let them think we're fragile." Commander Garth Vennick, the old war dog overseeing orbital defenses, had laughed when Vorex proposed deploying Iron Bastion against the Dominion's planet-cracking fleet. "They'll swat you like an insect," he had said. Maybe they would have had Earth given them the war they expected, a desperate last stand, a futile clawing for survival, but this ship was not built to cower. "Enemy projectors spooling up," Tactical Officer Ren Talvok reported, his voice clipped. "They're setting up a sequential barrage pattern, mapping our movement." The Dominion believed in efficiency through destruction. Their doctrine had toppled hundreds of worlds before this one. Send a flagship first, overload planetary defenses with a coordinated pulse-wave barrage, then unleash a final kinetic harvester strike to reduce the surface to molten rock. No resistance had ever survived it. They thought Iron Bastion would be no different. The bridge lights flickered. Vorex's jaw tightened as the apex unleashed hell. A superheated plasma lance speared toward them, the light so intense it seared retinal shadows into every eye on the bridge. A fraction of a second later, the ship bucked, inertial dampeners shrieking to compensate as the plasma wave struck their hull. And yet, no breach, no catastrophic failure. Instead, the impact dispersed across Iron Bastion's reactive lattice plating, the heat sinking into the ship's interlaced quantum dampeners. For the first time in Dominion history, an energy strike of that magnitude had not burned through its target. On the apex laser plasma displays, the kill confirmation blinked green. For a moment, they thought Iron Bastion had disintegrated on impact. Vorex exhaled slowly. "That's it," he murmured. "That's the mistake we needed." He turned toward Lieutenant Thomas Drex, head of weapons control. "Drex, tell me our capacitor readings." Drex ran a gloved hand across his console, eyes flicking between power redistribution markers. "Charge absorption at 83%. We can reroute excess into rail turrets within 8 seconds. "Then we show them," Vorex said, stepping forward, his boots striking the deck with measured force. "Target the apex's ventral shield emitters. Don't aim for hull damage. We don't need to break them. Just make them bleed power." "Aye, sir," Drex said. His fingers flicked across the interface, feeding the stored plasma energy into hyper-accelerated rail slugs. The ship's spinal turrets groaned, kinetic coils charging with a rising whine, ions crackling through the air like an oncoming storm. Through the viewport, the apex loomed, an obsidian leviathan, its sleek plating humming with predatory malice. It had never known fear. Vorex smiled grimly. "That changes now. Fire!" Iron Bastion exhaled violence. The rail slugs detonated from the barrel with a thunderclap, moving so fast they left behind fractured light trails, illuminating the cold void in streaks of shattered brilliance. The first shot punched into the apex's forward shields, the lattice disrupting, flickering erratically like a dying star. The second found its mark. A violent cascade of energy ruptured outward, blue and orange lightning corrupting the symmetry of the Dominion's shield harmonics. For the first time since its inception, the Zatoran apex staggered. On the enemy bridge, strategist Threx Vadun's mandibles clicked in rapid succession, a telltale sign of confusion. His hands danced over his console, frantic, disbelieving. "Recalibrate shields! Their weapons are bleeding us!" Admiral Zypherin Valkis, the ship's commanding officer, turned his head slowly, a thick crease forming across his brow ridge. Impossible. That vessel should have been dust. But it wasn't. Instead, the Iron Bastion, the ship they had mocked, the experimental anomaly that Earth's own defense command had dismissed as a desperate gamble, had just crippled one of their most feared warships. A hollow silence spread through the Apex's command deck, an absence of sound heavier than any explosion. Then the alarms started shrieking. "Redirect primary reactor flow," Vadun barked. "We need to compensate." It was too late. Vorex leaned over the console, eyes fixed on the Apex as his ship coiled for the next strike, charging faster, adapting, waiting. "Now they know," he said, his voice even, measured. "We aren't the ones who should be afraid." The Apex launched retaliatory strikes, but the flaw in their thinking had already been exposed. They believed their firepower was a guarantee of victory, but they had never accounted for an enemy that could take everything they threw and give it back in kind. "Commander," Ren Talvok said from the tactical station, his voice carrying the weight of realization, "they're shifting their formation, preparing for close-quarters engagement." Vorex considered the implications. They had never fought an enemy like this before, and if the Dominion wanted to test the limits of Iron Bastion in direct combat, then that only meant one thing. "They think they still have the upper hand," Vorex said, his hand steady on the console. "They still believe this war will end the way they want it to." His lips curved into something cold, something resolute. "We'll let them keep believing that, right until we tear their fleet apart." Through the viewport, the Apex's fleet began its advance. The Zatoran Apex lurched in space, its shields flickering like a failing heartbeat. The Dominion had never known retreat, until now. On the bridge of Iron Bastion, Lieutenant Commander Dane Vorex stood still, watching the shifting formation of the Apex's battle group through the laser plasma displays. The Dominion fleet tightened into a wedge, a predatory maneuver meant to close the gap and deliver a finishing strike. "They want to box us in," Tactical Officer Ren Talvok said, his fingers dragging across the display, tracking the formation shifts. "They're adapting." "They think adaptation is just a change in tactics," Vorex muttered, his gaze unwavering. "We're going to show them what it really means." The ship shuddered under sudden impact. The Apex had regained partial power to its forward weapons, and now a concentrated ion blast struck the starboard plating. The force surged through Iron Bastion's lattice, rerouting into the capacitor banks, but the pressure groaned through the ship's spine. Vorex's muscles tensed as he caught the faintest shudder in the deck plating beneath his boots, a ripple of energy that wasn't from impact. It was the ship holding more than it could safely process. "Absorption is climbing past safety thresholds," Lieutenant Thomas Drex warned, his fingers moving rapidly over the console. "We can't keep taking hits at this rate without bleeding off power." "They're pushing to overload us," Talvok said, shifting in his seat. "They can't win against the ship as it stands, so they'll force us to break under our own weight." Vorex exhaled slowly, his mind pulling apart the threads of Dominion battle logic. The Apex wasn't trying to destroy them in one blow anymore. It was playing for attrition, trying to flood the lattice system until it ruptured under its own stored energy. Clever. It wouldn't work. "Relic," Vorex called toward the younger ensign at the weapons console. "What's the status of our rail slugs?" Relic's eyes darted across the display, hands moving with trained efficiency. "Coils charged, payload primed. We can fire, but it won't do much if their shield harmonics are back to full cycle." "They won't be at full cycle," Vorex countered. "That last rupture left their emitters misaligned. Drex, how much of their last attack did we absorb?" 87%, Drex replied without hesitation. "We could reroute into weapons, but if we don't regulate the dispersal, we risk feedback distortion." Vorex nodded, rolling his shoulders as if shedding an unseen weight. The Dominion had always seen power as a singular force. More was always better. But humanity? Humanity understood leverage. "Don't dump it into the cannons," he said. "Feed it into the kinetic redistribution matrix. I want the next rail slug boosted with a disruptor charge. Drex hesitated for only a second before his fingers moved across the controls, rerouting the energy. The hum of capacitors deep in the ship's core shifted into a heavier, charged resonance. Vorax turned back to Talvok. You said they were adapting. Show me how fast they learn. Talvok smirked, eyes narrowing as he input targeting data. They won't like the lesson. The rail turret locked on. The slug, now primed with a controlled destabilization pulse, fired in a burst of raw inertia, its wake leaving a temporary tear in the Dominion's gravity field. The shot ripped into the Apex's lower flank, burrowing past the already weakened shields. The disruption effect rippled outward, cascading into the exposed power lines. Inside the Apex, alarms shrieked, and strategist Threx Vadun's mandibles clicked rapidly as half their stabilizers failed in an instant. "Contain the breach!" Vadun barked, his hands slamming against the controls. "Redirect emergency shielding." The Dominion had superior firepower, but their systems were rigid, made to be unshakable, not malleable. They had never planned for an enemy that could manipulate their own power back against them. Admiral Zypherin Valkis gripped the rail of his command station, his pale, segmented fingers flexing against the control surface. "Vadun, tell me this is not what it appears to be." Vadun's throat vibrated in suppressed panic. "Their weapons are feeding off our own output. They are mirroring our pulse frequencies back into our shielding." Valky straightened, his dark gaze locking onto the real-time battlefield display. For the first time in centuries, he saw something that the Dominion's war doctrine had never prepared for. "We are losing." Back on Iron Bastion, Talvok let out a sharp exhale as he studied the enemy formation. "They're destabilizing. Some of their forward ships are breaking off formation." "They're buying time," Vorax corrected, his jaw set. "They're waiting for reinforcements." Drex swore under his breath. "We don't have the power reserves to keep matching this cycle. If another Apex-class warship drops in, we aren't going to give them that chance," Vorax interrupted. "We push now." Talvok's fingers hesitated over his console. "Are you sure?" "If we miscalculate," Vorax didn't let him finish. "We don't miscalculate. We adapt. Fire all slugs into their secondary core, now." Reddick's hands moved instantly. Iron Bastion's rail cannons discharged in rapid succession, each shot carrying a fraction of the stolen energy from the Dominion's own attacks. The projectiles slammed into the Apex's ventral section, shattering its weakened structure. The reactor core flickered, sputtered, then imploded. A deep space detonation erupted outward, swallowing Dominion cruisers in a storm of kinetic shockwaves. On the Dominion bridge, Admiral Valkis staggered forward, his pupils contracting as he stared at the displays. The Zatoran Apex, the most feared warship of their fleet, was breaking apart before his eyes. Vadun's voice was a breathless rasp. "Orders, Admiral?" Valkis exhaled slowly. His nostrils flared, his fingers tightening against the control panel. Then his decision was made. "Send for the War Marshal." In the void beyond, space rippled. New contacts blinked onto Iron Bastion's heads-up display, each one bigger than the last. A second Dominion fleet had arrived. Vorax stepped back from his console, his expression unreadable. He watched the display as the new fleet dropped from hyperspace, their energy signatures far heavier than the first wave. Talvok muttered under his breath. "Well, that's an issue." A beat of silence stretched through the bridge. Then Vorax turned to his crew, voice steady. "Then we'll show them what we've learned." Outside, the Dominion came in force, and Iron Bastion was waiting. The second Dominion fleet surged from hyperspace like a tidal force, displacing reality itself in a violent gravitational wake. Unlike the first wave, these ships did not maneuver with the arrogant, calculated grace of an inevitable conqueror. No, these were warships built for destruction, their formations tighter, their weapons already primed. The Apex class had failed. Now, the real slaughter would begin. On the bridge of Iron Bastion, the weight of the moment pressed into every breath, every motion. The enemy had learned, and now they came with an answer. Vorax kept his stance firm, watching the laser plasma displays pulse with data streams, fresh threat markers flooding the interface. There were at least twice as many ships as before, each signature carrying a denser power core reading. Ren Talvok didn't bother with formalities. This isn't just reinforcements. This is a correction. Lieutenant Thomas Drex's hands hovered over power allocation controls, eyes flicking between readouts. We're at 90% energy saturation. One wrong move, and we'll be generating more power than we can expel. Vorex turned toward him. Then let's make sure the first move isn't ours. A burst of corona flares bloomed across the heads-up display. The Dominion had already opened fire. "Incoming!" Ensign Reddick shouted. "Two." Iron Bastion lurched as the first kinetic projectiles slammed into its starboard plating. Unlike the first wave's energy-based attacks, these weapons carried sheer mass and velocity, meant to punch through hulls and splinter them apart from within. "Impact dispersion is holding," Drex called out. "But if they keep stacking these strikes, we'll run out of places to redirect force." "They're driving us into a break pattern," Talvok said. His tone wasn't panicked, but it carried an unspoken urgency. Vorex's fingers drummed against the console, calculating variables faster than the Dominion could reset their targeting locks. "Then let them keep thinking that—" A Dominion dreadnought closed the gap, its flanking cruisers moving in a near-orbital sweep, encircling Iron Bastion from multiple angles. The sheer magnitude of their presence blocked out the starlight, casting shadows that stretched like jagged wounds across the bridge viewport. Admiral Zephyrin Valky watched from the command deck of the Dominion flagship, his gaze sharpened by a quiet, seething hatred. The first wave's failure had stung their pride. But this humiliation in battle, this was unacceptable. "Bring us within point-blank range," Valky commanded, his voice flat. "If they want to steal our energy, let them see what uncalculated force truly looks like." Vadun's mandibles twitched. "Sir, that would mean exposing our—" "I didn't ask for a debate," Valky's interrupted. "I asked for eradication." On Iron Bastion, warning alerts cascaded through the bridge as the Dominion pushed into melee distance. "That's new," Talvok muttered. "They've never closed this tight before." "They're done testing us," Vorex said. His throat was dry. "They're rolling the dice." The Dominion unleashed chaos. Point defense turrets vomited plasma rounds in tight sprays, while twin-linked fusion lances fired in synchronized bursts, locking Iron Bastion in a web of overlapping assault vectors. Vorex's jaw tightened as the deck vibrated beneath him, the impact forces scattering through the ship's frame like echoes of a distant earthquake. The lights dimmed for a split second, barely noticeable, but enough for him to feel the system strain. "They're not giving us time to reallocate charge dispersal," Drex warned. "They want us to choke on our own buildup." Vorex's mind moved faster than his body, piecing together fragments of half-formed strategies, risk assessments, the raw instinct of a soldier who had never had the luxury of a perfect solution. And then, an idea. "Reddick," he said sharply, "bring up their close-range targeting algorithms. What's their lock variance?" Reddick's fingers flew over his console, sweat beading at his temple. "They're committing too hard on single trajectory fixes, no redundancies. If we—" Vorex snapped his fingers. "That's it." Talvok glanced over, eyes narrowing. "You want to make them overshoot?" "Not just overshoot," Vorex said. "I want them to fire at ghosts." Drex caught on first. "We force-feed them false heat signatures, make them think they've got clear lock-ons. Then we move before the shot lands," Vorex finished. Talvok exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "That's either genius or suicide." Vorex grinned, the expression cold, sharp. "No reason it can't be both." He turned back to the bridge. "Execute the ghost array maneuver. Redirect hull temperature fluctuations into decoy vectors. Make them chase phantoms." A pulse of energy surged through the ship's external plating, releasing a cascade of false target reflections, a heat signature bloom that confused every Dominion targeting system within range. On the Dominion flagship, Vadun's talons clenched against his console, his head snapping toward the data feeds. "Sir," he hissed, "something's wrong with our targeting array. Our shots aren't landing." Valkys leaned forward. his stare cutting through the screen. "That ship," he murmured, voice dark with realization. "It's learning." The next Dominion barrage struck nothing but empty space, and then Iron Bastion struck back. The rail turrets fired in silent fury, tearing through unshielded hull plating and ripping internal compartments apart before countermeasures could deploy. The dreadnought that had tried to box them in now listed to one side, venting atmosphere into the cold beyond. Vorex didn't blink. He had no pity for enemies who believed they were entitled to conquest. "They're adjusting to the interference," Drex warned. "Then we don't give them time," Vorex said. "Relic, Talvok, fire a wide-band suppression volley. I want everything within a 5-kilometer radius blinded." The rail slugs ignited as they left the cannons, each shot fueled by residual Dominion power, bending the very laws of engagement back against their creators. Valky watched his fleet buckle. This was no longer a skirmish. This was a reckoning. He inhaled slowly, watching the destruction unfold. His people had laughed at this ship. His advisors had dismissed it as a crude experiment. No one was laughing now. "Sir," Vadun said quietly. "Orders." Valky's jaw tightened. "Call in the war marshal." Silence stretched through the command deck. Even Vadun hesitated. "You're certain?" Valky's eyes never left the display. "They wanted a lesson," he murmured. "Now they'll understand the true cost of resistance." Somewhere far beyond the battlefield, another signal whispered through the darkness, and the Dominion's final answer was coming. A Dominion dreadnought collapsed in on itself, its reactor folding under the cascading chain reaction of misfired energy dispersals. Across the battlefield, ships burned, their once perfect formations now jagged, broken lines of desperation. The war was no longer a clean conquest for them. It had become a slow, grinding disintegration. And yet, they weren't retreating. From Iron Bastion's laser plasma displays, the tactical grid flashed with new incoming contacts, larger than before, signatures dense with power surges that didn't match standard Dominion energy matrices. These weren't mere reinforcements. Vorex exhaled sharply. "That's their real hammer." A deep distortion ripple spread across the interface, gravitational fluctuations warping the spatial readings. A Dominion supercarrier had arrived. Talvok leaned forward, analyzing the data streams. His voice was low, deliberate. "We're looking at something different, sir. This ship's core reactor is too concentrated. If I'm reading this right, it's packing the firepower of an entire fleet in one hull." Drex's hands tightened on the console. "And if it fires all at once? Then we're standing inside the barrel of a planet breaker," Talvok answered. Silence settled for half a breath. Not fear, calculation. The pieces had changed, the battlefield had shifted again. Vorex rolled his shoulders back, pushing away exhaustion that threatened to seep into his muscles. "All right," he said. "Let's crack it open before they get comfortable." He moved toward the command interface, his presence anchoring the bridge. "Talvok, give me a full diagnostic on our kinetic redistribution network. How much more punishment can we take?" Talvok studied the readings. "Absorption levels are holding, but we're running out of storage. If we take one direct hit from that thing, we're going to be—" He stopped, exhaling through his nose, on the wrong side of an expanding debris field. Drex was already pulling up secondary analysis. "We can't afford to tank the next wave, sir. We need a way to dissipate excess charge faster than we're absorbing it." Vorex nodded. "All right, so let's make them fire at something that doesn't exist." Talvok's brow furrowed. "You want to run another ghost array?" "Not just that," Vorex said, his voice steady. "I want to bait them into overloading their own core." The crew fell still for half a second, then Drex's fingers started moving. "If we trick them into committing their primary weapon, they'll dump everything into a single shot," Vorex finished. "A shot they can't afford to miss." Talvok exhaled, half a grin forming. "That's bold." Vorex gestured to the battlefield beyond, where Dominion ships still pushed forward despite their staggering losses. "They think we're just buying time. We're going to let them believe that right up until we turn their cannon into a funeral pyre. Relic adjusted the display settings, pulling in a more detailed read on the supercarrier. If we want them to commit, we need to look weak enough to warrant overkill. Then let's start breaking apart, Vorex said. Talvok, coordinate targeted power fluctuations across our lattice plating. Make it look like our grid is starting to fail. Relic, stagger thruster output. Give them irregular readings on our movement pattern. I want to sell this. Make them see us unraveling. The bridge came alive with controlled chaos. Commands were issued, readjustments made on the fly. Iron Bastion began to list, its external plating flickering with simulated power disruptions, vents opening to spill heat signatures in uneven bursts. From the Dominion warship, Admiral Valkys narrowed his eyes. He watched the patterns unfold, his gaze sharp, unreadable. His flagship had suffered far more than it ever should have, and yet this enemy vessel still resisted. Vadun hesitated at his side. Sir, I recommend we send another wave of standard fire. If we deploy the main cannon now, we might— Valky cut him off with a slow, calculated exhale. Might is for the uncertain, he said. We end this now. He turned to his weapons control officer. Charge the primary cannon. All energy reserves. Vadun's mandibles twitched. But, sir, I said all of it. A moment passed. Then the supercarrier's core began its cycle. On Iron Bastion, Drex's display flashed red. They're committing. Talvok muttered. All or nothing. Good, Vorex said. Gaze locked onto the laser plasma display. Let's make sure it's nothing. The supercarrier's axial core reactor surged, its gravitational signature warping space as energy funneled through its primary cannon arrays. The readings spiked, higher than projected thresholds, higher than any Dominion battle records on file. Drex's fingers tightened against his station. That's too much power. They don't know that yet, Vorex said. His voice was quiet, but his command carried like the weight of an executioner's axe. Talvok, on my mark. Full dispersal. Drex, redirect excess power into targeted magnetron inversions. When they fire, we need to reflect just enough energy to destabilize their core. Relic's hands hovered over weapons control. And if it doesn't work, Vorex exhaled, then there won't be enough left of us to care. The Dominion supercarrier fired. A beam of concentrated annihilation ripped forward, the very fabric of space vibrating around its wake. Iron Bastion moved. The energy stream did not find its target. Instead, it collided into a redirected gravitational mirror. A ghost projection of heat and spatial distortions fed back into a singular focal point. The Dominion had just fired their entire arsenal into a contained anomaly. The result was instantaneous. The weapon feedback looped inward, disrupting the ship's internal power matrix, forcing a cascading overload through every conduit, every exhaust vent, every energy capacitor that was meant to regulate the impossible forces they had dared to wield. Valkys barely had time to comprehend it. Then the supercarrier imploded. Not in fire, not in an explosion of light. It simply folded inward, every deck crushing into itself, swallowed whole by the force of its own miscalculation. The silence that followed was not one of peace. It was the silence of a force realizing it was no longer the strongest in the room. On Iron Bastion's bridge, the crew stared at the aftermath, the void where a Dominion flagship had once stood. Drex's voice broke first, a near whisper. They're falling back. Talvok exhaled. Not just falling back, they're retreating. Vorex let the moment settle, the weight of it pressing into his bones. Then he turned, his voice carrying the finality of a closing chapter. They came here believing we were prey, he said. He looked back at the battlefield, at the dying embers of Dominion arrogance. They were wrong. The Dominion fleet fractured. Their retreat was not calculated. It was panicked, disjointed, desperate. Ships burned, their formation collapsed, and what had once been an armada of absolute supremacy now resembled a scattering of wounded beasts, limping toward the void. The shockwave from the supercarrier's implosion had left lingering distortions in the gravitational field, warping the battlefield into a chaotic graveyard of debris and drifting wreckage. Vorex watched the laser plasma display, tracking the remnants of their once invincible enemy. A ship blinked out of existence, its hyperdrive spooling too soon, tearing itself apart in the process. Another Dominion cruiser faltered, its damaged thrusters spewing uneven bursts of energy as it spiraled away. For the first time since the war began, the Dominion was not choosing to leave. They were fleeing. Talvok let out a slow breath. That's it. They're breaking completely. Drex's hands hovered over the weapons control. Do we let them go? Vorex said nothing at first. He turned, facing the bridge crew, letting the silence weigh down the moment. The Dominion had ruled with unquestioned dominance for centuries. Every species they had encountered had fallen without exception, without resistance, without hope, until now. His voice carried through the deck, calm and unshaken. We let them live because they need to remember what happened here. Talvok turned slightly, considering. You think they'll come back? They will, Vorex said. But next time, they won't come with arrogance. They'll come with fear. And that's the difference. The heads-up display flickered as a direct transmission cut through the battle channel encryption. It wasn't Dominion. This was coming from Earth. Admiral Garth Vennick's face appeared, his eyes sharp, unreadable. His voice came through with measured intensity. What the hell did you just do? Vorex held his ground. We didn't just win a battle, sir. We rewrote the rules of war. Vennick exhaled, gaze flicking over the wreckage that littered the display behind him. I have every surviving council member on my back demanding an explanation. The entire Earth defense grid watched you dismantle a fleet that should have wiped us out. You turned their own firepower against them. And that, he exhaled again, as if wrestling with his own disbelief. That isn't something we can just pretend didn't happen. A sharp beep cut into the transmission. A second communication signal was requesting access. The ID marker didn't belong to Earth. Dominion. Talvok stiffened. They don't send transmissions unless they're dictating surrender terms. Vorex flicked a glance toward Drex. Patch it through. The screen shifted. The Dominion Admiral Zephyrin Valkis appeared, standing amid the dim, flickering light of his crippled flagship's command deck. His expression was no longer arrogant, no longer steeped in the certainty of victory. His eyes studied Vorex with a new weight, one that carried something the Dominion had never needed to feel before: caution. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then, Valkis's voice cut through, measured but heavy. Your ship is an abomination. Vorex tilted his head slightly, his voice even. Is that what you call the things you don't understand? Valkis's jaw tightened. His fleet had been ripped apart, his war doctrine reduced to a flaw in their own logic. He could order another strike. He could command the remainder of his forces to die screaming into the void. But even he knew it wouldn't change what had already happened. The Dominion had been defeated not by superior firepower, not by overwhelming force, but by adaptability, by ingenuity, by a species that had refused to obey the rules of conquest. Valkis spoke again, slower this time. This war is not over. Vorex met his gaze without flinching. You're right. It's just the first time you've realized it's not already won. For the first time in Dominion history, a transmission from their own admiral cut to static first. They were leaving, and the silence they left behind was more deafening than any explosion. Drex let out a short, sharp breath. Never thought I'd see that happen. Talvok leaned back slightly, crossing his arms. They'll spend years trying to understand what went wrong, trying to justify it, make sense of it. They'll never make sense of it, Vorex said quietly, because to them, the idea of a lesser species outmaneuvering them is impossible. They'll tell themselves it was luck, a fluke, a gap in their calculations. His voice darkened. They won't understand the truth. Drex arched an eyebrow. And what's that? Vorex turned away from the fading remnants of the battle, looking out into the future that had just been reshaped. That no matter how strong they thought they were, he said, his voice calm, certain, unshaken, they were always fighting the wrong war. The bridge was quiet. Then, the command relay sparked to life again. Sir, Reddick called out, his voice carrying an edge of something new. We're getting multiple incoming transmissions. Not Dominion. New signals. Vorex frowned, stepping forward. From where? Reddick's fingers moved fast over the console. Unknown species. No recorded affiliation. But they're all broadcasting on open frequencies. They saw the battle. He exhaled. And they're asking for us by name. Talvok's expression flickered into something unreadable. They just watched us dismantle one of the most feared fleets in the galaxy. Exactly, Vorex murmured. The display lit up with incoming messages, transmissions from civilizations that had once believed the Dominion could never be challenged. Some were hailing Iron Bastion with caution, others with something else entirely. Hope. Admiral Vennick's voice cut in again, lower now. You understand what this means, don't you? Vorex looked at the stars ahead, at the battlefield left behind. The Dominion had called this war a lesson for humanity. Instead, they had just taught the galaxy something else entirely. They laughed at this ship, Vorex said, until they realized what it could do. He turned to the crew, his voice steady, his resolve absolute. Set course. It's time they all learn.